Мать, блядь!
Ukraine virtually leveled Russia's most strategic airbase in Kursk, Kalino, with 7 ATACMS missiles. Footage showed the explosions of the ATACMS missiles illuminating the night sky. Footage taken from inside a vehicle by airbase personnel also revealed the characteristic moment of the M74 submunition exploding on the airbase's grounds. The sparks from the missiles created a deep sense of panic at the airbase. The fact that the ATACMS missiles were able to strike Kalino, 96 kilometers from the border, so easily caused astonishment throughout Russia. The Russians claimed that there were 8 ATACMS targeting Kalino and stated that 7 of them were shot down. But everything was out in the open. The sounds of explosions and air raid sirens proved what the ATACMS had actually done to Kalino. These ATACMS attacks on the Kalino airbase in Kursk were part of the Ukrainian army's plan targeting the Crimean peninsula, which Russia had annexed. Kiev actually intended to direct the ATACMS missiles at Russian military assets in Crimea. Crimea has been purged of Russian air power. There are no Su-35s or MiG-31s here anymore. Only empty Russian air bases remain. Putin was helpless because the name of the threat was ATACMS. ATACMS missiles arrived silently, striking, and even the S-400s were helpless. Ukraine has now dominated the Crimean peninsula with ATACMS missiles for a long time. In other words, Kiev was executing its plan flawlessly. Dzhankoi, Saky, and Belbek air bases became targets for these missiles during the 2024 to 2025 period. Kiev actually signaled what it could do in the future, with these missiles starting in the summer of 2024 in Crimea. In May, the Belbek airbase was hit by American-made ATACMS missiles. An ATACMS missile was fired with great force at the Belbek airbase, located 230 kilometers from the front lines in southern Ukraine. The missile penetrated the Russian air defense system all the way to Belbek, causing an incredible explosion at the airbase. High-resolution satellite images released after the attack showed that 1 MiG-31 and 3 Su-27 fighter jets were completely destroyed, while 1 MiG-29 was severely damaged. Deep burn marks and debris accumulation were observed in the refueling area right next to the main runway. This area is known to be a vital point in terms of operational cycle. The same images also revealed dark stains not previously present in the parking areas and structural damage to the outer edges of the aircraft shelters. Open-source intelligence sources shared photos indicating that an S-300/S-400 air defense system stationed in Belbek had been hit. It is understood that the 92 N6 gravestone radar, a critical radar component of the S-400, was targeted, and this loss is considered to have created a serious gap in Russian air defense integrity. After this attack, noticeable changes occurred in the layout of Belbek. The construction of heavily fortified shelters accelerated, aircraft were moved further inland, and the density of the parking area was deliberately reduced. Thus, the difference between the visible power of a base and its real power became apparent for the first time in such a clear manner. Russian forces on the peninsula suspect that the Ukrainian army could also carry out ATACMS attacks on the Kerch Bridge. If ATACMS missiles hit Kerch and destroy the bridge, this 19-kilometer logistics artery could spell the end for both Russian forces in Crimea and the Kremlin. Let's briefly discuss the power of ATACMS. ATACMS is an INS GPS-guided ballistic munition fired from M142 HIMARS and M270 MLRS launchers. The core body is 0.61 meters in diameter and approximately 4 meters long, shortening the interception window with a steep and rapid terminal dive angle after launch. The M39/M39 A1 variants carry M74 submunitions with a range of 165 to 300 kilometers and produce a wide area effect in open parking lots and around runways. The M48/M57 variants carry a single-piece, approximately 500-pound Class HE unitary warhead with a range of 270 to 300 kilometers and are suitable for hard targets such as fuel depots, radar nodes, command facilities, and bridge approaches. While HIMARS carries a single ATACMS in a pod, the M270 keeps 2 missiles ready at the same time. The shoot-and-scoot doctrine allows for rapid position change after firing. GPS-aided accuracy can reach the single-digit to low double-digit meter range, enabling sustained pressure in saturated wave configurations in layered air defense zones like Crimea. Meanwhile, the ATACMS strike on the Belbek base in Crimea was not an isolated incident. On April 17, 2024, the Dzhankoi airbase at the northern tip of Crimea was also targeted by a similar ATACMS attack. Known as one of the centers of frontline operations due to its proximity to Donbass, this base had long been on Ukraine's radar. Satellite images shared by Planet Labs after the attack confirmed extensive damage in the area south of the base where the S-400/S-300 batteries are located. At least 4 main components were completely destroyed. Burn marks in the surrounding area indicated that the attack had a wider impact. It became clear that the missiles were aimed not only at air defense systems, but also at Dzhankoi's 2 main runways. Hard ground areas east of the base were also targeted, with extensive burn marks in the area where some Pantsir S-1 or similar short-range air defense vehicles were located. Images indicated that these systems had either been directly hit or damaged by the explosions. ATACMS strikes against the peninsula continued during the summer months. In June 2024, ATACMS missiles targeted the NIP-16 Deep Space Communication Facility in the city of Vitino. This facility, now known as the 40th Separate Command and Measurement Complex, is part of the Titov Main Test and Space Systems Control Center, which is affiliated with the Russian Aerospace Forces. Built during the Cold War, the structure was used for years to track Soviet and Russian space missions. However, it is no longer just a monitoring facility, it also serves as an active center for command and control operations. The attack was carried out in 2 waves. In the first wave, the section containing approximately 20 large antenna dishes, the facility's most prominent feature, was targeted. Some of these dishes were arranged in large octagonal arrays and played a critical role in both military satellite communications and the management of space missions. Satellite imagery clearly showed burn marks across the large open area in this region, particularly over a short distance to the east. Similar signs of blackened soil and structural damage were detected north and east of the octagonal antenna array. The regular positioning of the burn areas indicates that the attack targeted specific radar electronic infrastructure. The strike on NIP-16 is not just physical damage. It represents a direct blow to Russia's military space architecture and long-range command capabilities. Another strike was recorded at another airfield in July 2024, indicating that all bases within range were under pressure. New satellite images around Saky showed fresh crater marks and burn marks in areas outside the facility. The story behind the arrival of the ATACMS that achieved these successes in Ukraine is also quite noteworthy. Volodymyr Zelensky announced to the public in 2023 that the US had provided ATACMS to the Ukrainian armed forces. This announcement was confirmed shortly thereafter by the US National Security Council. On the same day, Ukraine deployed this system in combat for the first time. 2 separate airports in Berdyansk and Luhansk were struck by short-range ATACMS missiles. Footage shared on social media showed at least 6 missiles being fired from the M142 HIMARS system. These first batches were mostly the 165-kilometer range M39A1 type, i.e., the short-range version. However, this step signified crossing a threshold in the profile of support the West was providing to Ukraine in the war. From that moment on, ATACMS became not just ammunition, but a geopolitical message and an element of strategic balance. In the months that followed, the shipment of missiles and the management of ammunition stocks were intensely debated in both Kyiv and Washington. In the spring of 2024, deliveries of advanced variants with a range of up to 300 kilometers began. The political limit set by the US during this period was clear: Ukraine could only use these missiles over its own occupied territories. In other words, attacks on Russia's mainland were not possible with these weapons. However, this situation did not last long. By early 2025, signs began to emerge that some of the ATACMS provided by the US to Ukraine included modified and upgraded long-range models. This development marked a critical threshold in the course of the war. Kyiv now had an effective and sustainable deterrent at its disposal, capable of precision strikes at greater distances. As the range increased, the map changed. If political will strengthens further and the US decides to deploy the PRSM family, the new generation derivatives of ATACMS, these systems with a range of 500 kilometers will reach a point where they threaten Russia's A2/AD networks deep within its territory. Command centers along the Crimea-Rostov line, logistics arteries around Kerch, missile radar systems, and air bases would now become fixed targets. This is because Russia's southern logistics depend on two main corridors, the Kerch Bridge and the railway road extending to the peninsula via Melitopol-Dzhankoi. ATACMS is not a direct one-shot, one-kill solution for Kerch. However, intermittent strikes on soft targets such as bridge approach ramps, railway junctions, signaling areas, fuel, supply storage, and locomotive parks can permanently reduce total capacity. Ukraine has already increased the cost of defending Kerch since the summer of 2024. The damage the bridge has sustained from previous attacks and repeated closures has demonstrated how risky the single artery dependency is. The ATACMS range also allows you to target the railway junctions through which cargo enters Crimea. The pressure on Dzhankoi is a typical example of this. If the radar eye and fuel rail junctions are strained within the same week, the frequency of trains and convoys returning from Rostov to Crimea decreases. Each decrease increases the need for and cost of forward storage. This thins the buffers in the flow of ammunition and fuel approaching the front. Thinner buffers make it harder for the front to maintain its tempo during surprise night operations. A rhythm that forces Crimea's air and logistics network to operate at half capacity every week incurs three permanent costs for the Russian side: air defense ammunition component consumption, repair hardening investment, and freight insurance premium differences. The cost of 48 N6/9 M96 class interception munitions and the cost asymmetry of the ATACMS UAV mix create a reverse leverage effect on the defender's budget. 24 interception fires in one night can result in a multiplier bill for the attacking side's expenditure on UAVs, plus several ballistics. Shelter and distributed fuel investments reflected in satellite imagery mean continuous increases in concrete, steel, and labor costs. This investment may reduce destruction, but does not eliminate the cost. The increased risk of attacks on ports, roads, and railways around Crimea triggers not only temporary transportation disruptions, but also a systematic cost spiral. Every possibility of attack translates into a direct insurance problem for carriers and logistics companies. This causes insurance companies to raise premiums. Moreover, this increase applies not only to traditional transportation, but also to alternative transportation structures known as the shadow fleet, established to circumvent sanctions. So even if the name of the risk changes, the market prices this cost in any case. The ripple effect of this cost is multi-layered. Every attack or sabotage means that the damaged infrastructure is out of service during the repair period. This adds delays to the transport chain on an hourly or daily basis. Every hour of delay extends delivery times, which in turn leads to order cancellations or compensation penalties due to the failure of both intermediate goods and final products to arrive on time. At the same time, this situation directly affects the inventory management of manufacturers or suppliers. For the defense industry in particular, such logistical disruptions turn into a serious planning crisis. Since the sustainability of the front line depends on the continuity of ammunition and spare parts flow, even if alternative routes are created for such risky lines, complete security cannot be guaranteed. This forces military planners to carry more forward stock. In other words, the required ammunition and parts must be sent to the front in advance and in larger quantities than expected. However, this situation requires increasing storage capacity, raising the transport volume of the logistics chain, and tying cash flow to these pre-transported stocks. In other words, a serious relaxation of financial discipline is emerging in the name of the sustainability of the war. This scenario affects not only the transport chain, but also the fixed infrastructure itself. Hardening investments initiated after losses at facilities such as Belbek Air Base are directly included in the budget. Although these construction activities create some employment and spending for the local economy, in military terms, the cost-benefit curve is often negative. This is because these investments do not prevent attacks, they only attempt to mitigate their impact. And this is not sustainable. News about air bases and bridges creates a perception of constant fragility, not only operationally, but also in civilian psychology. Flight bans, traffic restrictions, temporary bridge closures, and the alert regime in coastal defense periodically disrupt daily life on the peninsula. Tourism, retail, and small businesses are directly affected by this fluctuation. The tension between the budget allocated for repairs and social services grows. As emergency shelter and critical day stockpiling behaviors become widespread among the resident population, the definition of normal recedes in a way that is difficult to regain. Rotation and leave plans for military families become more uncertain. Uncertainty breeds fatigue. Semi-permanent migration flows within and outside Crimea intensify. This creates a second wave of pressure on civilian infrastructure. As the defense rhetoric hardens, the civilians' daily response may become detached from the language of politics. This disconnect is the unseen cost of a long war. The most critical outcome of ATACMS pressure is the inability to give a clear answer to the question, when. Defense must remain constantly on alert. This vigilance diminishes personnel's attention and decision-making quality over time. Small mistakes can have major consequences on critical nights. Withdrawing bases inward and reducing aircraft visibility provides fertile ground for the propaganda narrative that the planes are scared. The defense side responds with the "we are protecting ourselves" framework. Partial closures of bridges and rail lines repeatedly convey the message that transportation is fragile to both civilians and military personnel. Crimea's status as a political symbol turns every strike into a major headline. This is the multiplier of psychological impact. The attrition strategy produces a more stable pressure graph than a single night of victory. As society becomes accustomed to the alarm, it fixes the new normal at a lower expectation. This is an advantage for the side of the war that plays in favor of time. So what is Russia doing? In the short term, it is responding with defense, broader false targets, intense EW, distributed fuel, relocatable radars, and shelters. In the medium term, the focus is on thickening anti-drone, anti-surface layers around Kerch, creating backup routes on rail lines, and shortening the reaction time of repair engineering units. In the long term, new lines that would reduce dependence on a single artery are discussed in theory. In practice, cost, time, and security limit this. In the political sphere, the rhetoric of expanding the buffer zone has been part of the Kremlin's line since April 2024. However, the logistical and manpower implications of this rhetoric are already constrained by high attrition rates on the Ukrainian front. The protection of Crimea remains one of the steepest cost-risk curves. In short, Crimea is not just a strategic piece of land on the map. It has also become the nerve center of Russia's security narrative, its claim to military capability, and its geopolitical prestige. Every successful strike with ATACMS missiles hits not only a target, but also the Kremlin's capacity to balance the costs of war. Because now every attack creates a wide range of effects, from economic balances to civilian psychology, from military mobility to foreign policy rhetoric, not just a runway or radar system. Every new explosion in Crimea shows that Russia is bleeding a little more in its war of attrition, that its patience is running out as much as its ammunition. If this rhythm continues and Western support remains uninterrupted, holding Crimea may become not only strategically but also mathematically impossible. And this possibility could be the beginning of an end that Moscow is not prepared for. Thank you for watching.